A confession only tells you what happened, but a profiler wants to know why it happened. Welcome to Character Analysis True Crime, the channel where we explore criminal behavior, investigative psychology, and the hidden patterns inside real cases. A year ago this week, the loved ones and victims of Bryan Kohberger sat in a courtroom for their victim impact statements. And if you watched this hearing the way I did, what was palpable was the grief and the sadness and the rage that all of these survivors and victims were cycling through as each one of them gave their speech, while Bryan Kohberger sat almost stone-faced. After the hearing, and after seeing such an outpouring of emotion from the survivors and the family and the loved ones, there was this outrage that law enforcement and the prosecution hadn't forced Bryan Kohberger to tell them what happened that night. Now, what people don't understand is that there's a difference between allocuting or allocution and the type of interviews that we see between FBI profilers and investigators and killers. As we saw in the hearing where Bryan Kohberger changed his plea, he did allocute. Judge Hippler went through the charges and each victim and asked Bryan Kohberger, "Did you commit this crime?" And Kohberger said yes. Allocution is part of a legal process. Now, at the end of the victim impact statements, Judge Hippler asked Bryan Kohberger if he had anything else to say to any of the family members or the surviving roommates. And Bryan Kohberger said that he respectfully declined. Legally, that's his right. The answers that people actually want, like how he committed the crime, did he have any help, that's not necessarily part of allocution. That's typically what comes out in an interview that a killer does with profilers from the FBI. I recently listened to a podcast episode from the show The Consult. Now, I'm going to link to this podcast below. It's phenomenal. It's where former FBI profilers talk about current and past cases, but they don't go through, the basic facts of a case. They profile the people involved with the case. One of the co-hosts, Julia Crowley, explained that in her experience, she'd never heard of these types of interviews being part of a plea deal, meaning she's never heard of them being required as part of a plea deal, which I thought was really interesting. And then she went on to explain that these kinds of interviews with convicted killers, they're not as simple as people seem to think they are. It's not as simple as they just shackle the guy in an orange jumpsuit to the table and then a couple of guys sit across from them with, a legal pad and a pen and ask them questions. There are many steps involved with this process before they can even begin to ask questions. First, according to Julia, they need to do a psych assessment. And then they have to perform what they call psychometric testing. And that's to help determine the killer's cognitive abilities, personality traits, emotional functioning, etc. Then they're going to want a workup of any neurological or biochemical issues that the killer might have. They want the medical records. They want to know, is there any kind of chemical imbalance going on? Was there any history of trauma? And maybe there was like a reoccurring injury, let's say like a broken arm that might indicate abuse in their childhood. They want to know everything they can about this killer and their past. Most importantly, they want to know how their brain functions. And the next step is they want to delve into the killer's personal life. They want to talk to their friends, their coworkers, their acquaintances, their former partners, their family members. They want to get a sense of the dynamics that the killer had with all these different people, or if they had any. And if they had a romantic history, they want to get a sense of what was their type romantically or sexually. They're going to want to go through the psychopathy checklist, which was developed by Robert Hare. It's a personality trait assessment that they perform in order to determine if there's any kind of psychopathic traits. And that's where all the previous information that they just gathered, the medical records, the interviews with peers and coworkers and family members and friends, all of that comes into play when they go through this psychopathy checklist. And then they're going to want to know, what is this person's history? What do they have a history of trauma? What possible triggers could they have? And once they gather all this information and they analyze it, they now have what they need to start this interview process. And what they need is a baseline. That baseline and all that historical data and medical data is going to help them determine if their conversation with this killer, if their answers, if what this killer is telling them is the truth. Because this isn't just about getting answers regarding what happened that night. Profilers and law enforcement and FBI agents, they use all of this data and can sometimes apply it to future cases. So as you can see, this is sometimes a several month, if not longer, ordeal before they can even sit down and start asking questions. Now, Rex Heuermann, the Long Island serial killer, he agreed to sit down for this series of interviews as part of his plea deal. Something that's really interesting about Rex Heuermann is that he had what was called planning documents. As you can see, these documents are very detailed. What Rex Heuermann did was read the books by sort of the OG or one of the OG criminal profilers, John Douglas. Douglas, along with Dr. Ann Burgess, were featured as main characters in the Netflix show Mindhunter. So Heuermann went through Douglas's notes, and he got a sense of what he needed to do in order to evade detection. And he troubleshot every possible problem he might have when committing these crimes, like DNA, witnesses, tracing the source of the supplies, footprints and shoe prints. He wrote notes like, don't hunt in certain areas for too long so that you won't get caught on camera. Don't charge or use like an ATM or a credit card for when you get gas. Most disturbing, he had a list of what to do when it came to body prep of the victims, which included removing marks from torture or removing tattoos or really anything that could identify the victim, removing their hands and their head. These documents were so thorough that it's no wonder that it took them so long to catch him. So you can imagine that when you go up against somebody like Rex Heuermann or a Bryan Kohberger, that kind of planning, that kind of knowledge is going to add an extra level of difficulty. And what the profilers on the consult said was that these interviews, it's a very delicate balance. It's a dance because they have to maintain control, but they also don't want to seem like they are judging or shaming the killer. They're taught do not react, no matter what sort of grotesque, horrible thing they confess to doing. You cannot have a reaction. And they go into these interviews preparing for the inevitable attempts at manipulation. Their goal when they sit down and have these interviews with killers like Rex Heuermann isn't just, okay, so tell us about the kills. It's about, how did they find their targets? How did they get that kind of access? How did they avoid detection? And you have to remember that these killers, they see these interviews as sort of a break from the monotony, from their cells, from prison. So they're going to do what they can to try and stretch these interviews out. When it comes to killers like Rex Heuermann or Israel Keyes or Bryan Kohberger, where they're probably going to start in terms of the line of questions for this interview is, when did this fantasy start and how did it start? Crimes like this usually have several phases, and they almost always start with the fantasy. And the fantasy may not have started as killing women. The original fantasy could be about dominating them, could be about scaring them. Fear is a tool that a lot of killers use. Rex Heuermann used to call the families of his victims after the victims were dead. He liked terrorizing them. It gave him a sense of power and control. And that's what he would do to fill in those gaps when he couldn't kill because he knew maybe law enforcement was watching him. And this is why I say that I fully believe Bryan Kohberger was writing things online about that night. I will stand 10 toes down that I believe Bryan Kohberger was frat anon and that he wrote those posts on 4chan about the two Davids and how you could see the King Road house from the Sigma Chi house, and they left their phones at home to avoid pings and their DNA wouldn't be in CODIS. Just the act of writing that stuff out is going to be a rush for a killer. And then the response. That's a whole other high, to see people react, to see the horror, to see the amazement, to see the admiration. Because remember, in that post, it said that the whole thing took 19 minutes door to door. So when they're in the cool down phase where they can't kill, where they can't act, things like writing posts on internet forums and watching the reaction, that helps fulfill that urge that they have. BTK used to write letters to the police. He went dormant for so long, but he couldn't help himself. He started messing with the police again and writing them letters, bragging about what he'd done, almost daring them to catch him. And then he was a big idiot and he put something on a floppy disk that was traced back to his church. Because narcissists always mess up. And let's not forget Luca Magnotta, the Canadian murderer who originally was abusing and harming animals and worked up to killing somebody. He actually engaged in this online game of cat and mouse where he kind of terrorized this group of internet sleuths. At one point, he posted a video from one of their jobs that was up on their website. Fear. That fear gives them control. Joseph James D'Angelo, who was the East Area rapist, he used to call his victims years after the attack just to scare them, just to get that rush, because he couldn't act out. Maybe he was married now. Maybe he didn't have the ability to come and go as he pleased without people wondering where he was. Killers like this, they find ways to sort of feed that urge. There's multiple stages of planning a crime like the Idaho 4 or Rex Heuermann's crimes or Israel Keyes. There's the fantasy, there's the target selection, there's the planning of the crime itself, committing the crime, the aftermath. If there are any crimes in particular that you want me to take these like stages and do some research on and we can discuss, let me know. But we learn about these stages through these interviews. That's the purpose of them. These interviews aren't just to give us the answers or to fill in the blanks because we're missing pieces of the puzzle. Something that I think that a lot of us have forgotten, especially when it comes to the Idaho 4 cases, these types of interviews, they're not for us. These types of interviews are to give the families some attempt at closure. It's to give profilers and investigators data to use when trying to catch other killers of similar crimes. But most importantly, they're about trying to prevent these crimes from happening by identifying outliers and cues that people might exhibit that could indicate that they are going to harm somebody else. Now, I have two different channels, Character Analysis True Crime and Character Analysis Podcast. I would love it if you follow both. The Character Analysis podcast is more about examining human behavior in dating and internet culture and dark psychology. You can follow that page on YouTube at Character Analysis Pod, and you can follow that page on TikTok at Character Analysis Pod. And the Substack for the Character Analysis podcast is characteranalysispod.substack.com. Now, if you're just interested in true crime, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Follow me on TikTok at mycharacteranalysis, and follow my Character Analysis True Crime Substack at mycharacteranalysis.substack.com. All the links will be in the episode notes. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you guys soon.